Hello, and welcome once again to Conversations That Matter. And my earbud fell out for the first time in this show. Imagine that. Okay. We're coming to you from Paradiso Integrale in Umbria in Italy. And I'm Mark Davenport, and I'm here with my mate, mentor, muse, and my prod and my pusher, Heidi Hernlein. And after a word from her about the best way to watch this and participate in this talk, we'll go right to our guest. So, Heidi?
Yeah, if in case if you watch on YouTube, please go to the wisdomfactory.net/live-streaming, and you will be directed to the personal page of our guest, who is Keryn Paull.
Say hello, Keryn.
Hello, hi. Yes, I'm Keryn.
Okay.
Very nice to be here.
Oh, wonderful to have you.
And the topic or the title is?
You covered the title up. Why I Loved But Left South Africa. Yeah, okay, that's what we're calling it. Yeah. And Keryn is from that fabled country, South Africa. It's home to great animals in Kruger National Park, but also to the dark history of apartheid and diamonds and gold, and the miracle of Nelson Mandela and the sad aftermath of his legacy. And she grew up and found her way through this complex social and political maze, now eventually finding a new home in England. And we'll ask how that began and how it progressed with many geographical and psychic moves. So we'll get both the inside story and the outside. So I'd like to turn it over to Keryn now, but first, you may correct any lies we've already told about you. Okay.
Okay. Yes, with the lies or the misinformation, no, there hasn't been that much. I have left the country not because it was too difficult to navigate through the maze of political and dark history and all the rest of it. Purely, really financial and social that I left that country. Not that I don't expect to never return, because my family's there and I will return one day, but it is actually lovely to explore other parts of the world, and I'm really enjoying living in England at the moment.
Okay.
So what we like to do is to ask you a little bit, you have seen a lot of the world and lived in several cultures, to tell us a little bit, first of all, of South Africa. You were born not in South Africa, but in what was called then Rhodesia, no?
That's right, yes.
So tell us a little bit about your childhood there and what happened there, and then how things changed, because I'm quite sure that most people don't know a lot about that. For instance, Africa for me is like the elephants, I have posted the picture of the elephant, the lions, and it's sort of a miracle country. And then I have heard about all these problems. Yeah, sure. But whenever I see wonderful pictures of nature, I think, oh, that must be a paradise. So tell us a little bit.
Yes, it is a paradise. You're absolutely right. It is completely a paradise. And well, obviously, I really only know Southern Africa. I don't know any places north of that or further north. It really, really is a paradise. You've got huge, huge spaces. You've got big skies. The weather is very largely great. It's not that far from the equator, well, compared to, for instance, living in Britain, which is something like 50 degrees north, Zimbabwe, and then going further to south to South Africa are more like 20, at the most 30 degrees south. So very, very temperate areas. Obviously, it gets very hot. But yeah, really, really incredibly beautiful places. And you're right. I mean, the animals just have such a wonderful added impact on what those places are like. Of course, most people actually live in urban areas. Most people haven't got time to spend vast amounts being around the animals or taking care of animals or thinking or involving their lives with animals, except if you work with them. So for most of us, the animals are actually at a remove. And in order to see the animals nowadays, when I was very little, which I'll get back to, it was not quite like that. But nowadays it costs an awful lot of money in order to go and visit the animals. And if you come from South Africa, or if you come from those parts of the world, you still pay a great deal of money to go and see them. In all of those wonderful, incredible wilderness landscapes that hopefully will still be there for our children and our children's children, despite the fact that all sorts of landscapes and wildernesses and areas of our world are being so badly disturbed as they are. But when I grew up in Rhodesia, as it was then, we lived in a very, very remote area on a farm. My parents were farming. We were pioneer farmers. They were opening up new land. Of course, as a young child, you don't realize that. You don't understand that looking back as an adult, you can kind of like create a picture of what it meant. So as a young person, together with my brother and sister, we ran around what we call the bush. The outdoors in Africa, in southern Africa, is known as the bush. So we just ran around mostly barefoot, climbing trees. Our companions were all of the children of the people who worked on the farm. So those were mostly our companions. And together with them, we would climb trees. We would go catching birds and things. I mean, we learned amazing things. Like, for instance, one of the things that stays in my mind is the way the African people had a system, and of course I never learned it when I was little, of creating some kind of a gum. I don't know what they mixed together to make a gum. And then they would put the gum on small pieces of stick in the trees, or some twigs and some thin, very thin branches, and they would catch birds like that. And I remember being completely amazed that such a thing happened. Of course, I wouldn't want to do that anymore. And I think at the time I also felt a little bit uncomfortable. But as an African person who lived, before the advent of the white people, I mean, they lived in the middle of nowhere, as you would anticipate Bushmen to live. They literally had water, they had food from the animals and the vegetable and the vegetation around them, and very little else. And obviously there was a social structure that was in place to a point. But actually Zimbabwe was quite a sparsely populated country. And where we lived and where I grew up, that area is still, if I look on Google Maps now, it's still the middle of nowhere. So even though there's a sort of belt through the middle of Zimbabwe that sort of goes northeast towards the southwest, where all the main towns are, and that's the kind of like major belt where activities happen and where commerce and all the rest of it. But for the rest, a lot of it is very, very, very remote and mostly untouched, except of course a large part of it is farmland.
It's still farmland. Yeah.
Yeah, it's farmland. But what's so amazing is that some of it, or large areas of it, are still maybe not even farmland. They're just wilderness, which the African people kind of like scratch a living out of, because it's tribal areas. So the various different clans and tribes live in those places, and there's a sort of a sense of ownership. I can't say that I know exactly what goes on in Zimbabwe these days, but there would be a sense of ownership of a group, a clan, a tribe, and they would kind of like populate those lands and use them. But in the main, still incredibly, incredibly rural, which is a marvelous thing to think about.
They have two questions. One is, how is the climate? Do they have enough water for doing farms?
So Zimbabwe is better than South Africa in that Zimbabwe is mostly, and I don't know how things are changing in the last number of years, mostly has enough water. It's a summer rainfall area, so in the winter things get very dry, and you don't expect to see rain then. And then for probably 6 to 8 months of the year, starting a kind of October, because that is now spring coming into summer, going through till say May the following year, which is now turning into winter, one expects good rains. And it comes in the form of mostly of large, big sometimes scary thunderstorms and all the rest of it. So the weather can get very interesting and very dramatic, but not in a way that you would have tornadoes or hurricanes. It's a little milder than that. South Africa, on the other hand, has got very big water problems. For instance, well, actually, should we get onto that in a while? Because in fact, it's a big drama in South Africa these days.
Okay.
Yeah. No, what I was also interested is the products which they produce. What do they do with them? Are they exported? Is that what we find in the supermarkets as exotic fruits and vegetables, or
From the farms?
From the farms, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So again, talking about Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, as it was, I mean, I grew up, my father farming tobacco, so Rhodesia / Zimbabwe were always very big tobacco producers, one of the largest tobacco producers in the world. So that obviously went all over the world. And then there was things like citrus and maize. Maize is the staple food of the African people. Mm-hmm. So maize was grown, and Zimbabwe was pretty much known as a breadbasket, certainly of Southern Africa. Of course, you may remember that in 2000, the president of that country, Robert Mugabe, actually turned against the white farmers who had large-scale commercial farms, turned against them and threw them all off their lands. And subsequently, there is very little agricultural output in Zimbabwe. Yeah. I mean, I think it's slowly picking up again, and maybe there is a bit of export of tobacco and stuff like that. But certainly, people in Zimbabwe are now very impoverished and bordering on starvation due to the fact that there is A, no production, and B, no means to buy things because the whole infrastructure of commerce has broken down.
Isn't it stupid, no, that people out of sort of hatred or revenge revolt against the people and throw them out, like it has been in times when they killed the farmers, and then there's nobody who can do it. Then they starve. It's so short-sighted. People, we humans are so short-sighted. We have these emotional things, and then afterwards we suffer of our own decisions.
And it's the story of human history, isn't it? I mean, throughout history, this is what's happened.
And obviously we don't learn. I mean, people don't learn from other people's experience. If it's even in 2000 still happening in the world, sometimes I get desperate about you.
It's 2018 and it's still happening.
Yeah.
And, I mean, look what's happened in the last number of years. I mean, in terms of the Middle East, I mean, the Middle East has been ruined, and people's lives have just been completely shattered. And in Europe, we're now seeing the consequences of what's been going on in the Middle East. I mean, I think in Italy, you experience it even more than we do here in the UK.
Yeah, but
things we have to watch on television, on the news.
Yeah.
Well, it's a strange thing because here in our village, immigrants. We're supposed to have immigrants. We've been allotted a certain number of immigrants that should be here. But the local bureaucracy just manages not to make it happen.
Manages to bypass this problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Lacking solidarity because they are all massed in the south somewhere in certain places, and
that are controlled by the mafia.
Yeah, and we are creating.
I didn't know that.
We are creating the problems of the future, but we are not talking about Italy. We are talking about you and your life.
Yeah.
So Africa, and I mean, as I say, I really only know Southern Africa, is the most incredible place. It's the most remarkable place. I mean, apart from animals and the massive spaces and this incredible endless horizon and all of those things that are completely part of nature, the spirit of the African person is completely amazing. They're so different to Europeans. They're so different to Westerners. There's a huge joie de vivre. There's this huge sense of enjoyment of life, and the opposite, which is, they'll happily go out and kill each other and all the rest of it. I mean, obviously that kind of stuff doesn't happen quite so much anymore, but there's a spiritedness to African people which you don't really find anywhere else, or I haven't ever noticed. You know, we're all so grown up, we're all so highly educated, we're all so civilized, and Africans just can bring a joy to their everyday horrible lives. Because I mean, you know, we're just talking about Zimbabwe and how the people are now suffering as a result of things that have happened over the last few years there. But still, you talk to a person in the street and they will give you the biggest smile. They'll give you the most positive attitude. They're really, really incredible people. So as a result, the culture of the various different peoples in Africa is just amazing. And the music, for instance, the African music, wow, incredible stuff comes out of Africa where music is concerned.
Yeah. And dance.
Yeah.
And dance.
Oh yes.
And all sorts of things. So so that colors how one perceives, how I perceive my homeland. It colors how I think about things, just because it's also remarkable in that no matter what goes down, and you can tear your hair out in frustration at the nonsense that you see. You know, we were just talking about Mugabe and what's happened in Zimbabwe and how that's been brought to its knees and completely decimated. And then just the frustration of having to deal with people in sort of business environments and you know the civic people, the kind of like officers of state that you have to deal with, and how awful it is because people don't know the answer or they can't bother to give you the answer. And I'm sure you experience it in Italy sometimes.
Well, we get too many answers.
Many different answers to the same question.
Well, there you go. Exactly. And so it's not much difference. So there's this dichotomy of amazingly friendly, outgoing, expansive, generous, incredibly generous spirit and soul. And at the same time, enough that, as I say, you want to tear your hair out. They can drive you crazy. People can drive you crazy because they don't care if they're not running their countries properly. They don't care if they're hurting their neighbors. I mean, you know, from a political point of view, if they're letting their rural community down or certain communities down. On the other hand, I suppose it happens in Europe too. It's just not quite the same. Yeah.
Oh, we're much more sophisticated about it. Thank you.
Yeah, yes. Better in doing it. Yeah.
and we manage in the Western world to mask these things better. Is that right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you said before, we have lost the spirit of joy of living. We are so burdened about life, and we have to, you know, everything. Even if we have a lot of, I don't know, money or possessions or whatever, nobody is happy. They want always more, the newest iPhone, the newest car, the newest I don't know what. And this is also not
so
the right
so
thing.
Don't be fooled. We're not at all happy here, okay?
And that just reminds me, actually, you saying all of that, you know, we've all become burdened. Obviously in Africa, in the parts of Africa that I know, people are also incredibly burdened, but there is a childlike appreciation of the everyday, which is just so remarkable, and one can just learn so much from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say? Shall we? You just thought I had an idea that she is organizing tourism to learn how to live from indigenous South African people. Yes, something like that. That would be good, because you know we don't even know how well we live. So that comes to the other question. You are now in England. You said that you couldn't make a living anymore in South Africa. So how is the situation of employment and of work and survival, let's say?
Okay, so living in South Africa, there's no social structure designed to support people. There's a little bit of social benefit that goes to the very poor, there's pensions and there's grants for young unmarried mothers, and there's grants for disabled people to a very, very small extent. But in the main, 99.9%, we all have to make our own way in the world if you're an African. Whereas living in Britain, there is a structure in place and there's support that allows all sorts of things to just be that much easier. And obviously the thing that comes to mind is the NHS, which is marvelous. The National Health Service, yes.
Thank you.
Which is marvelous because it's free or largely free to the entire population. It's also overburdened nowadays. It wasn't because I lived in Britain in the 1970s as well, and I've only recently come back here. It's now completely overburdened, probably because there's a growing population, which expanded beyond the understanding of the people who created the National Health Service in the first place, and also the fact that you've got an aging population. But there just is a sense that there is a whole lot more going on. There's a whole lot better infrastructure. And I think because there's larger populations, or there's more of a density of population, although that shouldn't affect anything, there's just a sense that there's a lot more going on here and in Britain, and that it's easier to work, it's easier to find work, and for instance, obviously there's things like unemployment benefits and all the rest of it, which are much more large scale than there are for Africans, because in South Africa, it's the poor people and the people who were disenfranchised before, the Africans, in other words, who benefit from any social grants that there are. White people can't. And so it was my own choices through my life to always work for myself, to always be self-employed. I was always in artistic fields, to be self-employed, to be freelance. And as the years went by, because I'm a really bad business person, I was able to work really, really hard and do lots of things and be very creative. But ultimately, things just started to slide in terms of the income that I was getting in relation to the costs. And that, I think, is something that's actually affecting most of us in the world, because things have changed enormously, haven't they, in terms of the value of money, what's happened to money since, say, the 1980s and all the neoliberalism, and how, well, we're all standing still these days. We're not improving in what we earn. What we earn now is the same as what we earned 15 years ago, for instance, but the cost of living has just gone up and up, or 20 years ago.
So you are now in UK, but your daughter, she has studied here in Italy, and I got to know her. And now she's back in South Africa. So obviously she and her husband have found a way to live there.
Yes.
What can a white person live on in South Africa? You said the benefits go mainly to Black people. So it's a sort of a racism now, only reverted, isn't it? But
there was a historic injustice and a historic inequality which has needed to be addressed.
Sure.
And it is being addressed. But the unfortunate part about all of this is that South Africa became independent from and left apartheid behind in 1994, and of course with great good intentions, people like Nelson Mandela and the ANC people who were around him at the time were fully committed to creating a more just society and to making it possible for all of the Africans who'd been disenfranchised to find their way into the commercial center of what the country could produce, could become. Unfortunately, it hasn't really worked out because of a lot of ineptitude and actually disinterest in the government. And, of course, government trickles down to millions of different departments and to into provinces and local areas, etc. And it just really hasn't come together for the people who needed to be uplifted as a result of all of those years of apartheid and all of those years of colonial rule. It really just hasn't come together because, as I say, ineptitude, inefficiency, and as happens everywhere, corruption. So the kinds of monies that should have been going to uplift people, most importantly through education, obviously through healthcare, obviously through programs to train people in work, apprenticeships and all the rest of it. Those kinds of infrastructures are breaking down rather than being built up, even though, of course, that's exactly what should have happened in the last 23, we're coming up for 23 years of South Africa being independent. And in fact, it's gone backwards in many ways. I mean, the saddest thing for most of us, or the thing that can make a person really angry, is how the education system has actually suffered in the last 20 years, as opposed to improving for all of those people who, in the apartheid years, all the African people, I don't know any of the statistics, but I do know that all through the apartheid era, education for white people was very well funded, and education for Black people was very badly funded. So they were at a disadvantage. Subsequent to independence, instead of that turning around massively and immediately, it really hasn't happened at all. Corruption, ineptitude, efficiency, and another thing is the strength of the unions, because it's quite a socialist country, is South Africa. So the strength of the unions, the teachers' unions, are very strong and powerful, and they aren't really in the business of teaching, it wouldn't seem. They're in the business of being political or being salaried earners, and not necessarily putting, and in fact, very definitely not putting the education of the youth of the country at the fore. One of the great failures of the last 23 years. And of course, an uneducated population, this age group hasn't been. There's an entire generation of South Africans who now have not been educated. And what is that? How do they move forward? What do they bring to the country, to the success of the country and to the future of the country without an education? And of course, they become very angry, and they are further disenfranchised, actually.
Instead of being helped. I want to insert here, can I? Yeah. About what we saw on Medici TV. There is a documentary about South Africa opera. There is
yes,
original from Netherlands, I think, a Dutch
there was
person
a Dutch production,
who has created an opera school, and I see. We lately saw a competition. Another one, a singer from South Africa, has won the first prize. So they are creating wonderful opera singers, and opera is not their culture, but they have voices. You know, these voices, they touch you everywhere. They have, you know, it's so astonishing. Like for instance, when I see African people dance or walk, they have a different way of using their body. And this is also, I am a voice, let's say, expert, a singer. This is also for singing. When they sing these, but with these voices, which we Westerners or white people or whatever, acculturated people, we don't have these voices. They are just fascinating how they sing. And I have heard that now they get less funding too, and so they have less possibility. And there are many of these singers who came from townships, from the slums practically, and now have international fame. I mean, this is because of the initiative of one person, you know?
Yeah, I know.
People who want to do something and have money, they They could do a lot.
There's places to spend it. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, it's wonderful that you bring up that because that's exactly it. And as you say, it's someone coming from another country, and I think the same things happen for ballet and for various of the arts. And you're right. I mean, there's incredible voice, and that's what I mean. That's what I meant when I was talking about it in the beginning. The spirit. That's all part of that incredible spirit that Africans have, and their musicality and their capacity to move. Well, I mean, we all know that Black people dance the best. They really do move amazingly. And you're right. I mean, some of those opera singers. The only one who comes to mind for me at the moment is Pretty Yende. Incredible voices, as you say.
Yeah. I can't remember the names because they're very foreign to me, but we saw several, even guys, young guys, when they have to do the audition to be accepted in the school. You know, that was this documentary showed that when he sang for the people in his area, and they have no idea from opera in his neighborhood. Yeah. And he sang, and they, what is that? But, you know, and they talked also about how it was difficult first to sing, which is considered, you know, not their culture. But then most of them have the full support of, after a while, when they have gotten into it completely and got some success, they admire their idols then of other people. And wouldn't it be nice if there were more of these initiatives, you know?
Yeah. But just, you know, talking about the music and the dance and all the rest of it, actually artistically, it's an amazing place. I love South Africa from the perspective of the artistry that you find there. I mean, there's amazing artists in every field coming out of that country, and you know, from all the various different race groups actually. But incredible art and incredible ballet and music and dance and opera.
Yeah, and you say out of this country. Does it mean they have to go out of the country to get some recognition and be able to live from their art?
Well, I think that sometimes it's very difficult to live from your art, but it can be very difficult to live from your art in any country, really, can't it? So the lucky ones, you know, like the people that you've come across in the opera scene from South Africa, who have found through sponsorship and all the rest of it ways to be able to work internationally. They're obviously, you know, life for them has really been made, and they've got huge opportunities. And yeah, and there's obviously millions of people and masses of highly, highly talented people who aren't going anywhere just because it's not easy to. But and across the board, I mean, rock music, pop music, all sorts of incredible music in South Africa. It's amazing.
A while ago, we started to talk about your daughter and her husband and wondering what kind of opportunities they have in South Africa today.
Okay, so shall I tell you? So, so my son-in-law is Italian, he was born in South Africa, but he is Italian, and he spent years in Italy. And the time when Heidi and I have known each other in the past, it's been because my daughter was living in Italy, as was my son-in-law. He's an electrical engineer. He studied in South Africa. He trained in South Africa, but he moved to Italy, where he worked for quite a long time. But then opportunities started to open up in Southern Africa, and he's involved in very large-scale renewable energy projects, the kinds of energy projects that governments fund or governments support. And for him, he ultimately knew that he had to move back to South Africa because that is where the work is. And there's like in Italy, there's no opportunity to put big new infrastructure. And even though obviously all the countries of the world are needing to move to renewable energy sources, actually it's in the developing world that all of those things are there's space for them, or because as infrastructure needs to grow in developing countries, it's easy now for those things to happen automatically with different technologies as opposed to the old coal mines and all the rest of it to create electricity. Now we're using wind and solar, etc. So he would tell you that, well, in fact, he definitely needs to be there in Africa, in Southern Africa and in Africa, where they also, they've put projects together in different parts of Africa. So there's a lot of opportunities there, whereas Europe stabilized and is maybe, maybe there's, I was about to say maybe there's not that much opportunity, but of course it's not true at all. I mean, in millions of different environments, there's lots and lots of opportunity, and I'm seeing that living in this country. I mean, I lived in England all through my 20s, grew up in Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia, came to England, and then went back to South Africa in my late 20s. And just looking at it now, I mean, had I stayed in this country then, which I had the opportunity to, one can become a bus driver. There's a million things that one can do in this part of the world that are just normal jobs that aren't available to somebody like myself in South Africa, because those jobs go to a different population group, quite rightly, because there is actually fulfill all the jobs. There's a lot of unemployment in South Africa, in Southern Africa, in Africa as a whole, and part of that is to do with the lack of commercialization, maybe, or the lack of infrastructure upgrades, etc., that hampered largely by political aspects. But of course, there's lots and lots of opportunities in England, and for me, I've got an opportunity now to work here and earn a living, whereas in South Africa, I was always self-employed, and there's no ways that I could ever be employed. A, my age; B, the fact that I've always worked for myself. I'm pretty unemployable, really. I've been going down my own road for too long.
Well, I work for other people for a long time too, but I'm not employable anymore. No.
Right. By choice.
Isn't that interesting? The older we get, the more diverse we become.
Yeah, that's the question. The older you get, how is it in Africa if you don't have children? I mean, also for the Black population, do they have pensions? Do they have security? You said it is.
So South Africa does have a pension, a general pension, which is very low. It's probably the equivalent of about £50. So, at the most, that's sort of €70 a month. Where can you go with that? Okay, maybe I'm wrong by about €10 or £10, but not far wrong. So obviously it's less expensive to live there, but not necessarily massively less expensive. And do you know that actually, in terms of the pensions that go out to elderly people, they've got all sorts of family members who actually lean on them and depend on them to use their pension, not just for themselves, but for the rest of their family too.
Oh, wow.
You have any number of people trying to live off, let's even say it's €100 a month. I mean, it's unimaginable, but that's the sort of thing that's going on.
Yeah.
And how do they do that? How can they do that?
I'm always amazed. I'm always completely amazed how people actually manage to get by. It really is remarkable, and I really don't have an insight into how it happens. Obviously there is.
We couldn't do it.
No. I mean, that wouldn't last a week.
No.
And even if you are very, very careful with money, but how can you? I mean, that brings me to the thing of taxes and so on. How do people live? Do they have some house where they then have to pay taxes from this €100 a month? Or
a lot of people, and a lot of the people that we're talking about who earn €100 a month as an old age pension, would live not in a house that has to be paid, there's no municipal tax. The house that they live in could very often just be a mud hut, or a group of mud huts. So very, very informal. And then there's no taxes and all that sort of things to pay.
That would be sort of a slum.
No, that would be a rural area.
Okay.
That would be a rural area. Because, you know, if you live in a mud hut or something like that, I think that, I mean, there must be, of course, there's all sorts of shanty towns that are building up around all of the urban areas with lots of little small houses made out of corrugated to stick together. So there's lots of those people around. If you're lucky and you live in a rural area, you can have a very, very, very beautiful, exquisite little structure of a mud hut. I mean, because they can be very, very, very beautiful. And then, you know, people will have 3 or 4, and different cultures make round structures or make square structures and paint them beautifully with lovely geometric patterns or whatever. So in fact, that's a very, very nice structure to live in, because also it's completely natural. It's very much part of the natural world. It's the kind of thing that an environmentalist, such as myself, could be very attracted to living in. I mean, a tin shack in a shanty town is not the same thing at all.
Not the same. No.
And then how is it now? You talk about electricity, that the infrastructure is good, but then they have to pay. Or how is it with water? Do they have toilets? Or how is that?
No. So if you live in the kind of house we've just been talking about, you wouldn't have a toilet. How municipalities are coping with the influx of people to the surrounding areas of the cities, where shanty towns are building up at an enormous rate, with, as I say, all of these sort of tin shacks and make-do houses. I'm not absolutely certain how how municipalities cope with sewage and all the rest of it. Obviously, they're working really hard to put structure in place, because they are needing to take care of things like sewage and toilet facilities. Not something that I think about much. If you live in that mud hut in a rural area, you just walk off down the path, and maybe you take your little spade with you, or maybe you don't, and you live a very natural life.
Like our ancestors did, you know. Yeah,
and the kind of life that's actually becoming, that has a great attraction to it, because it's living with nature. Living close to nature is, well, there's nothing actually to beat it.
You are used to nature. I was used to nature. How is it with young people in both countries, you know? Do they appreciate nature and would do such a life, or if they have a choice, or would they prefer to be, you know, like today with every little gadget of electronics and
gadgets, huh?
Yeah, gadgets and tires in the bathroom and golden.
Well, you know, you've got different stratas of society, and your lower stratas of society, the kinds of people who would live in rural areas, still living a traditional life, they all hanker after something better. Most of all because money doesn't come to those parts of the country. You know, there isn't an infrastructure, there isn't a system that allows money to come to people. More historically, the African men have gone off to the cities, worked on the coal mines, etc., and in the mines, and they've sent money home to the rural areas to support their families. But of course, that money was only enough to take care of a family, not to give them the kinds of gadgets that we might be talking about if you were a first world person. Having said that, I think just about every person in South Africa, or certainly every adult person in South Africa these days, does have a cell phone. They might not have a smartphone, but pretty much everybody has a cell phone. So, and they're connected somehow or another. And there isn't electricity if you live in a mud hut. What is happening, and which I was part of for a while before I left South Africa, is the use of solar batteries and all sorts of things. You know, a little small solar battery with a tiny panel that you put outside, and of course the sun's mostly always shining, and you can charge a battery, you can charge a cell phone battery on that. And for me, those things are just completely remarkable. And then maybe one light, which is enough to sort of see, because of course rural children suffer if they live in those kinds of informal houses, because they need to do homework. They need to be able to come home from school at the end of the day and take care of all sorts of things, never mind what mum has to do in terms of looking after her family. And there's no light. They've got candles and they've got kerosene lamps, which of course are very dangerous things. So what is wonderful is to see how possible it is now to have one of those little small systems of a little panel and a battery, which is maybe big enough to provide one or two lights and the cell phone charger. And of course, then there's also all sorts of urbanized people who, yeah, they hanker and try their best to make sure that they get all of the gadgets that all of the youth all over the world are wanting to have these days.
Yeah, sure.
And if they can't get it through normal means, there's, you know, of course, the thing that, I mean, the theft of a cell phone, for instance, that just happens every second. People having their cell phones snatched off them. So people are finding ways to get these things.
Yeah. And not only the rich people get stolen their cell phones, probably they do it to each other, no?
Absolutely. Sure. Absolutely. You know, Africans aren't necessarily very nice to Africans.
We think, you know, they are different than we are, but they are not, obviously. Oh. So another question I have, the people who arrive now, the black people who arrive now in Italy, travel in miserable circumstances.
The refugees and the migrants.
Yeah, where do they come also from South Africa, or do they? Where would they go when they decide to leave the country? If they,
I think the people who are trying to escape their countries that aren't working to come to Europe are mostly Sudanese, Ethiopians, Eritreans, and the North Africans. And also West Africans.
Yes.
But not so much Southern Africans.
No.
So does that mean they have enough possibility in their country to not have the illusion that somewhere else it's much, much better and they can risk their lives for that?
Well, it's very, very far to come from Southern Africa to Europe, whereas people in the northern parts of Africa think it's not such a terrible long distance. What has happened since South Africa got its independence in 1994 was that masses and masses and masses of people from all over Africa have moved to South Africa. Because South Africa is what you might call a middle-sized economy. So there's a lot of success, financial success in South Africa, and there's a lot of economic possibilities.
And I'm sure that makes for civil troubles too.
It does, because then there's the South African people who don't have work, because unemployment is incredibly high, and everybody is not being accommodated within the structures, the economic structures. They then get very resentful that these people from other countries, like, for instance, Zimbabweans, are all very, very well educated. One of the things that Robert Mugabe did when he came to power in 1980 was to make sure that he got his countrymen educated. And Zimbabweans do very, very well in South Africa just because they have got that much higher of a level of education than the South Africans do. So yeah, so the South Africans can get very resentful, and every now and again there's a flare-up of xenophobic violence against people who come from other countries. But the flow doesn't stop, because Mozambicans, Malawians, Congolese, all sorts of people whose countries are failing are all arriving in South Africa as fast as you're seeing people arrive in Italy and in Europe. who are also leaving failing countries.
The thing is, then, you know, when so many come out, these countries who are doing better, then they won't do better either. And so everything goes down the hill. It's really such a horrible situation. So how can we deal with that, you know?
It's a world problem. It's not an African problem. It's a world problem, as we're seeing more and more that there's too many of us. We've pursued a route following the money, which isn't working. We needed to have a more nature-based, a more spiritual-based life, really, didn't we? In order to maybe support at a lower level of so-called civilized living that we all seem to want.
Yeah.
Well, we are left with these problems now, and we see how we figure that out. I wanted to acknowledge there is Gina from Victoria in the audience. Hello, Gina, and
in Canada, in British Columbia.
Yeah, Victoria.
Okay.
And welcome in Italy, UK, and South Africa.
Hopefully, I think my daughter's listening in, so she might be the one person. Yes, one of the things, just talking about commercial aspects of South Africa or the economic functionality of the country, there's approximately, out of 56 million people in the country, there's approximately 6 to maybe now 7 million taxpayers. Because those are the only people who actually earn enough money to pay tax. And you can imagine what an impact that has on the viability of a country, and how difficult it is to pull itself up by its bootstraps when you're not bringing in enough enough revenue. Absolutely. And then the government squanders the revenue as well. So
that's another story.
So we know a lot of people who try to change the economic system and preview that it will really change differently. So that would be a solution, no?
Yeah. But how do you see yourself going back to South Africa eventually?
Well, I do anticipate going back to South Africa. Obviously, that's where my family is. That is where I'm very comfortable, even though, as I say, having lived in this country before, I also really, I love living in England. I find it's such a fascinating place. In Britain, I mean, it's so jam-packed full of interesting things to do. The culture is incredible. The history is remarkable. But I do anticipate going back, most especially seeing as how very soon now, surprisingly enough, I don't know why I didn't think it would ever happen, my daughter will be giving birth to her first child in a few months' time, and then I'll be granny, and I mean, my heart will then be lost, won't it?
That's what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I did actually know that that one day this conundrum would come my way. So as much as I really, really enjoy living in England, and it is so much of an easier country to live in from the perspective of feeling some level of support. I mean, just for instance, there's a public transport system that functions. Whereas it's not the same in South Africa. But of course, you're dealing with two entirely different size spaces. Oh, excuse me. It's a massively huge country, South Africa. So moving around, you know, you need transport. But the fact that European countries are homogenous, you've got a population that has, for hundreds of years, been developing its culture and developing its capacity to live together, and to work well together, and then all of the infrastructure that's built up. You'll have to do the talking now.
So all the infrastructure that's built up serves to make the society run more smoothly.
Yes, exactly.
to one way or another.
Yeah, and it's also homogeneous, the level of development. While now we are in Europe facing that people of lower levels of development, as tribal, for instance, from Africa, tribal level come in. And so we have the problem from there, because people, as you say, see the world differently from different levels of development. And so it's a sort of a cultural clash. And we say, but how these people, and they don't understand us and we don't understand them. And really, really difficult if we don't find a way to, how do you say, acculturate them, to introduce them to our culture, then it will create huge problems. And so far we didn't have that, as you say. In Europe, we are sort of homogeneously grown in our countries. So
that's right.
More or less everybody at the same pace, you know. Now it's probably a huge amount of people who are just different. I'm sorry that you have this problem. Maybe you talk too much.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. Too much
I was going to say that I don't think that you'll ever get the cultures of those people to be able to meet yours, in that the gap is so enormous. There's such a different way of thinking. You know, I think, I mean, as Western people, as Europeans, we just would wish that all sorts of different cultures could, and nationalities, could please just get it about how you live politely side by side with each other. But if you come from a warring nation, or all sorts of things, or, you know, just the fact that gender issues are so different in the developing world, just as one small aspect of things. So yeah, I mean, it is the problem that Europe now faces in terms of how to integrate. I mean, just as a small little story, I never realized this, but obviously there's quite a big fishing culture in Britain, as there is probably all sorts of in most places of the world. But it's understood in this country that when you go fishing in one of the dams, and there's hundreds and hundreds of them because there's a lot of water in this country, you catch a fish, and when you're finished, you throw it back, because you're only doing it for the sport. And the point is, from the perspectives of sustainability, they can't have people just taking the fish out all day long. But with the migration to this country, and I think this is an issue with the Eastern Europeans. The Eastern Europeans have come to live here. They go fishing and they take the fish home to cook, which has caused a big rift and a big problem. Because how do you tell somebody very politely, please fish, but don't take the fish home with you. Put it back in the water so it can live for another day.
Yeah.
I mean, tiny little things like that.
Traditionally, you fished for food, so
yep.
Well, you know, they must have fished traditionally for food in this country, but they've learned now that it's more sustainable to catch the fish and throw it back in again. But how do you tell and persuade your neighbors from another country in Europe that they must please do the same thing? They'll just laugh at you. Why am I fishing? I'm fishing so I can take it home and eat it.
Yeah, and also what I noticed also from people from East Europe, that they want meat. Actually, also African people. That was the experience from Libera, no? That they want all the time meat, because meat means somehow, when you can have meat on your plate, that you are sort of
You're
rich,
prosperous, yes.
You know, and so we have come to the idea that maybe a day twice, maybe it's not a super good idea, no? But how can you tell
the health of the person, for the body, or for the planet?
Yeah, but people who are in this idea now, finally, I can eat all what I want, you know, how can you tell them you can't?
Yes, exactly.
No, they've got to find out themselves. They go through their own stages of growth.
Yeah, Mark is watching the hour. We are have done a whole hour talking about South Africa.
I've been listening to her voice get more difficult. I'm saying, oh, we're almost done. She can stop soon. Yeah, she doesn't have to continue to struggle.
I'm sorry for that.
I'm coughing in the background because I seem to have a real frog in my throat now.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, that was a very exciting experience talking to you two like this. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you that you came. Is it the first time that you talked in such a setting?
Yes, it is the first time. Yeah.
Oh, great.
We'll have to ask her again. Because she'll be a veteran then, yes.
We will ask you.
We can find more things on the same subject to talk about. Because
you know what? We
hear more about you next time.
Yeah, no, we will wait a little bit. We have the Conscious Aging series.
Okay.
And then we will ask you, how is the life as a grandmother in South Africa?
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And to everybody who is watching now, we have live viewers and who will watch in future on YouTube. Please connect with us and connect with Keryn. Her website is, her page on our website, thewisdomfactory.net/Keryn Paull with 2 L. And there you find everything about her, also descriptions, and you will find the recording, and you can share it with your friends.
And the timestamps.
The timestamps. Soon he will write what we have talked about in a few days. You will find that, and then you can easily go back on the video and see, at this point we talked about blah, blah, blah. That will soon be done. And thank you very much. And we see you next week with another topic. Not South Africa. It will be about group creation and we spaces. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Keryn.
Bye-bye.
Nice.